For those of you interested in international affairs and U.S. foreign policy and other types of foreign policy, let me fill you in, perhaps, on the situation in the Ukraine. Now, I realize that some people who listen to my channel just occasionally may not be interested in this at all. However, it is, we are essentially dealing with globalism here, and that it very much pertains to the global economic situation. So let me advance a perspective here that you're unlikely to hear in the US mainstream media, nor on RT, the Russian state media for that matter. So some of you have probably heard by now that there are massive protests going on in the Ukraine. So let me share with you a pretty interesting article so that you kind of know what's going on. So basically, this is the month of December of 2013, by the way. Protesters marched in Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, demanding the ouster of the president, Viktor Yanukovych, in the largest of a series of pro-European Union protests against that president. And his decision, which was taken in November of this year, to abandon an association agreement with the EU, the European Union. The right-wing parties leading these protests in coordination with EU officials and politicians had called for a 1,000,000-man march, and ultimately some 250,000 to 300,000 people showed up. So in a square called Independence Square in Kiev, it was basically the largest protest in Kiev since 2004, which was then called the Color Revolution. You remember the Orange Revolutions in Eastern Europe, perhaps, that ousted the pro-Russian Yanukovych and brought the pro-Western tandem of President Viktor Yushchenko and Prime Minister Julia Tymoshenko to power. Protesters on Independence Square were chanting "Resignation, resignation" while listening to speeches on the square. Some subsequently fanned out to occupy buildings in Kiev, government buildings, that is. The reactionary assembly of speakers on Independence Square included representatives of various billionaire oligarchs, far-right groups, and patriarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church. Yevgenia Tymoshenko, the daughter of former prime minister and billionaire natural gas magnate Julia Tymoshenko, whom Yanukovych has jailed, by the way, read a message from her mother calling for Yanukovych's immediate ouster. Oleg Tayinobog, I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing this name right, is essentially a neo-Nazi from the far-right nationalist Svoboda Freedom Party, notorious for his anti-Semitic statements, denounced Yanukovych's government for working on trade deals with Russia instead of the EU. He declared, "Today they fall on their knees in front of the president of Russia and surrender us to the Russians' customs union. And we demand to make public that what these secret negotiations were about. They bring us back to the time of Stalinism." It's quite amazing that neo-Nazis are now emerging in the Ukraine. A group of protesters carrying Svoboda party flags pulled down and destroyed, and you may have heard this in the mainstream media here in the US, a statue of Lenin and the co-leader of Leon Trotsky of the October Revolution, the October 17th Revolution back in 1917, which, started the formation of the Soviet Union. The situation remains explosive, with protesters blockading government buildings and so on, and fearing a crackdown by security forces. What this essentially amounts to here is a bitter factional struggle taking place between oligarchs from both sides. You have the oligarchs, who are essentially supported by political leaders in the EU, the Timoshenko faction. And then you have the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, who are supporting Yanukovych, who seeks closer relations with Russia. Basically, what these protests are about living conditions in the Ukraine. And some of these pro-European Union protesters, which are now protesting and asking for the government's ouster, are essentially, their living conditions are not rising, and they want to live with dignity. And they also don't like the anti-democratic measures being taken by the Yanukovych government, which is jailing opposition leaders because they have different opinions about things. So what we have here is a battle between oligarchic factions. This is not what you're seeing in place here are not pro-democratic movements. These movements, all of these movements, are essentially reactionary at this point. And the ability of such right-wing protests to proceed and win support amongst broader layers of the population who do not necessarily support the EU's social austerity agenda reflects the deep crisis of political life in the ex-Soviet republics as a whole. Because these republics have, after the fall of the Soviet Union, become easy prey to looting by international capital and political manipulation by Western imperialism, and, of course, the corrupt Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. The deep social discontent that exists finds expression mainly through movements that are exploited by reactionary and even fascist forces and agencies of imperialism from both sides. These movements are then used to turn the political situation even further to the right and mount further social attacks on the population. Ukraine is one of Europe's poorest countries. It is not the poorest, but it's pretty poor, with the world's second highest mortality rate, other than compared to South Africa. Social, I probably shouldn't say worlds. I shouldn't say world, okay, that is wrong. It doesn't have the highest mortality rate in the world. But among fairly developed nations, which Ukraine is, it certainly is pretty high on that list. Social anger is rising after a budget crisis led the Yanukovych government, which is now in power, and the people are calling for the ouster of that government, to cut off unemployment insurance to hundreds of thousands of workers in June. So the Yanukovych government is cutting unemployment extensions. The major banks and financial markets have cut off lending to the Ukraine, which is expected to need $18 billion in emergency funding by March. The state currently has enough financing only for 2 months, and there is fear of a possible devaluation of their currency. Now remember, they're not part of the European Union yet, so they're not on the euro. They have their own currency. And this currency had previously collapsed after the collapse of the European Union, which led to hyperinflation. In other words, everything started to cost much more for regular people on the street. This situation is definitely not improving. The EU, which the protesters are, it's here in the American press. It's being portrayed as these protesters simply want to join the EU, and that's their major goal. Basically, what they want is better living conditions. That is what they want. It's not necessarily to join the EU. Some of them might be, on board with that, but basically, the EU is working with the International Monetary Fund, demanding deep austerity measures, a 40% increase in gas and heating prices, state budget cuts, and freezing on minimum and average wages in exchange for a $15 billion loan. And these cuts aim to deepen the exploitation of the working class and make Ukraine more profitable for European businesses that would set up operations after Ukraine has established closer relations with the EU. Now, you're all seeing, or presumably you know, or maybe you don't, what is happening in Greece. Precisely the same scenario took place in Greece once Greece joined the EU. Loans were given, austerity measures were implemented, and now Greece is a complete mess. It's worse than it was before. The pro-EU and pro-Russian oligarchic factions are both maneuvering to keep the billions they looted from the theft of state property and the restoration of capitalism, and to place the full burden of the financial crisis basically on the working class of the Ukrainian people. And that's why people are pissed off over there. This is the more fundamental reason why the Yanukovych government has not sought to mobilize other social layers against the right-wing protests which are now taking place over there. So the situation is very complicated. The feuding between these different oligarchic factions offers free play for manipulation by Europeans, which, while it savagely is looting Greece and Spain, by the way, as well, tramples on mass popular opposition to austerity at home, hypocritically poses as a defender of the people and of democracy in Ukraine. Nothing could actually be further from the truth. Neither the EU nor the Russians want any kind of democracy in Ukraine. It's the oligarchs who are running the show. So basically, this is what's going on in the Ukraine. And so there you go. That's your foreign policy perspective, with a slightly more independent take on this whole situation. I'll post one of my sources down below so you can get a little bit of a different perspective and read the whole thing for yourself. Good night.